Welcome to the B'nai B'rith International podcast. I'm CEO Dan Mariash, and thank you for tuning in today. The 2019 film Sefarad explores the fascinating history of Oporto, the Jewish community in northern Portugal. Here to discuss the film and its impact is Dara Jeffries, a longtime member of the Jewish Community of Oporto, where she lived for most of her life until relocating with her family to Miami. She's a representative and spokesperson for the Oporto community in the United States. Dara, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, before we talk about the movie, I think we should perhaps set out some markers in terms of Portuguese Jewry and the history of the Jews of Portugal. And maybe in a few minutes you might be able to tell that story, bring us current, and then we can talk about the movie.
Okay, I'm not a scholar, but I do have a little bit of knowledge about it just from my own experience and having lived there. I mean, Jews, were on the Iberian Peninsula for thousands of years, so I'm not going to go back all that way. But at least to put it in context for the movie, I think it's important to have a little bit of understanding of the background and what was going on in Portugal. So Jews in Portugal actually thrived, and there was a very large community in the Middle Ages up through until the Inquisition, and they lived very peaceably with their neighbors, and they were very, very well regarded. And then there was edicts of expulsion in the 15th century, at the end of the 15th century, and that basically decimated the Jewish community. So Jews had a couple of options. They could either leave, and sometimes that wasn't so easy because it was you had to have contacts, you had to have money, you had to have ships. I mean, it wasn't such an easy thing to do. Or they could convert and become new Christians and intermarry and so on, and many did do that, in fact. Or they could pretend to convert and, carry on Judaism secretly, and many did that too. So you had these three different things that happened. But what that did was it basically, eradicated the practice of Judaism openly in Portugal for many, many years. And it's important to note that the Inquisition in Portugal was only formally, terminated at the end of the 19th century. So that really went on for a very long time. And you also had fascism in Portugal and sort of Nazi sympathizers and this sort of thing. So the Jewish communities, at least in the north, Lisbon was a little bit larger, but even so, it was never very large. But it was a little bit more established at the beginning of, I would say, the 20th century. But in Porto, it was really very, very few people. So after probably World War I, and certainly after World War II, there were some Jewish merchants and others that settled in Oporto, mostly Ashkenazi, and again, not very many. And they are the ones that really were the origins of reviving the Porto community that hadn't been around for many, many years. And they are the ones that founded the Oporto Jewish community, led by Captain Barros Basto, but he was part of this group that set it up. So you have centuries with hardly anything. Then at the start of the 20th century, you start to have, a little bit of a community. And that went on for a really long time, where you had a pretty stable community from the early 20th century, but very small, really very, very, very small. People would come and go, and there was not such a large community. And that changed in the last, I would say, 10 years. Because of a lot of things going on. I think because on the one hand, Portugal has become a very popular, attractive destination for people not only to visit, but to settle for lots of reasons. It's safe, there's not much anti-Semitism, and it's just become a real hotspot. So I think it's attracted a lot of attention. There's also, as you mentioned earlier, the question of why, Jews. There's this new nationality law that allows descendants of Sephardic Jews that were expelled during the Inquisition to regain Portuguese nationality, and that's attracted some attention as well. So I think for all these reasons, the community has grown, and today it numbers, I would say, well over 400, from so many different countries. Maybe, I don't know exactly, but maybe 30 different nationalities, I would say, and that's it in a snapshot.
Well, the movie, which is a theatrical release, it's a full-length motion picture, was actually screened at an international leadership meeting of B'nai B'rith, which we held in Lisbon some months ago. And curious, really, about the genesis for the idea of the film. And all these years pass, many of us in the Jewish world know about the expulsion from Portugal. And some have heard about conversos and about those who went underground, and this is much of the movie is about that and practice as Jews. But really, a lot of the details are missing. And now comes this motion picture. So how did this idea get started?
Well, actually, it was my husband's idea. He was a former president of the community, and he and I have always been very involved with the community. And he himself is a very artistic person and involved in music and media and so on. So it was kind of a natural concept for him that there was a story to tell, and the best way to tell it is with a feature movie. And so we proposed it to the board, and the board liked the idea because it was part of their mission anyway. I mean, it integrated into a lot of things that were going on in the community in terms of their mission, which is to foster cultural and educational awareness of Jewish history and culture through educational programs. I mean, I can talk about that in a little bit, but there's a lot of different things that the community is doing in terms of outreach, and this seemed to fit in very well with that idea.
Why was it's interesting because today documentaries seem to be the favored way of telling these stories, but you decided to go in a different direction with a theatrical movie which tells the story. What was the thinking behind going towards that as opposed to the documentary form?
Well, actually, again, that was my husband's idea because he just thought it would be just so much more appealing, as it's just so much more interesting than to watch a documentary. It just seemed more entertaining, really. I mean, it's just much more entertaining. And the best way to tell a story and to educate is if it's entertaining and interesting. So it seemed like a better way to tell the story. But that was it. I mean, there's no particular, thinking behind it other than it was a better way to tell a story.
So the story begins with the king and the expulsion order. Fill us in on the details about how this goes from that to become kind of a personal story, which transcends these 400 years of history.
Well, I should explain that precisely because this movie jumps, right? It only tells a little bit of the Inquisition, and then it jumps to modern day. This movie is actually going to be and is part of a group. It's actually going to be 4 movies because we're filling in the gaps about the Inquisition and modernity, and so it's not just this movie. So this movie is like one in a series to kind of tell the whole story, because there is this big gap from the time of the Inquisition to modernity, so that needs to be filled in, and that's going to be a part of this series of movies as well. In terms of why it's a personal story, it's personal in the sense that it tells us the story from the perspective of Porto, right? As opposed to all of Portugal or all of Iberia, because that's where we're from and that's what we knew. And we think that Porto is a very unique place. And in Oporto, we've done a lot of work with the local Catholic community and the Muslim community as well, the Islamic community. So it's always had a very unique dynamic with other religions, and it's a very ecumenical community. And so it's really our story because it's from the perspective of Porto, but also because there was an interesting story to tell about how this synagogue came to be built. I mean, it was a very unusual situation and really quite impressive and heroic that Captain Barros Basto managed to garner the funds and build a synagogue that was inaugurated in 1938, which, as we know, it was the start, just at the start of World War II, and under a fascist regime. So that is really quite an achievement to have done that at that time. And he had a vision that he would go and find all these descendants of the hidden Jews, and that they would want to come back and become, part of mainstream Judaism. But that didn't happen for a lot of reasons, and some of which are told in the movie. But he built this enormous synagogue because he thought that that's what would happen, that he would be able to fill it. So it's really a very large space, and it didn't pan out exactly as he planned.
How has the film been received in Portugal itself?
It's been well received. It's not had theatrical release. It's kept more to cultural and historical sort of museums and that sort of thing, and conferences and anything linked to. So it's been in lots of different cities. It's been in Bragança. It's been in Lisbon. It's been in Porto, obviously, but generally within a not a theatrical release. It's been more in the historic and sort of cultural environments, and there it's been very well received. It's had very good press.
Well, the timing seems as good. We've mentioned already the granting of passports to Jews who can establish their Portuguese roots, but there's also more going on in Portugal. And when we were there, as I said several months ago, we noticed the marking of Jewish sites and kind of the promotion of a Jewish heritage trail, for lack of another term, and kind of a revival of interest on the part of the tourism authorities, for example, in Portuguese Jewish history. Where do you see that going?
Well, that has already, to be fair, that's been going on for a few years. They have had for many years the tourism board established a Jewish history, route. They would call it rotas, this route where they would, literally establish for visitors a route they could take. But it's certainly grown tremendously, and there is an enormous amount of interest. I think because it's so prevalent. I mean, there really is an awful lot of Jewish history and culture and sites. As you mentioned, people are finding remnants and Jewish Stars of David, carved into stone walls and things like that all over. So I think people have gotten quite excited about it, and because it really isn't a very anti-Semitic country. They're quite proud of their Jewish heritage. So I think that's why it's been a focus, and also I think they realize it's something that is a very interesting for tourist purposes and travel. I mean, people find it a very interesting thing to come to Portugal to view.
Well, I certainly can attest to that. I mean, they took our group, for example, to Castel David in the eastern part of the country on the Spanish border to see the former synagogue there, but also the bridge, the stone bridge over which tens of thousands of Spanish Jews were said to have traversed after the expulsion in 1492 and then going into Portugal. Of course, they didn't stay very long, at least many of them, because of the expulsion order. But there certainly seems to be a lot to see and a lot to delve into. To go back to the film for just a moment, now the film is being shown abroad. What is the intended audience?
I mean, there wasn't a specific intended audience. It's anybody that's interested in history and culture and Jewish and things Jewish in general. It's interesting too because I've people that aren't Jewish and friends of mine that aren't Jewish and that have seen it have liked it a lot because it is such a different story. A lot of people don't know this part of history or this part of Portugal. So I think for anybody that's interested in such matters, it tells a very interesting story. And so I don't think there's a specific audience, but probably more tailored to people that would be interested in this, in things that are of a historical nature.
Right, and there are plans afoot, you said, for 4 films. What will the next one be? So when I say 4, so there's already Sefarad, and there's also another one which already has been made and is already available publicly as well, which is actually a short movie. It's only 6 minutes long, and it's called The Nun's Kaddish, and that has actually done incredibly well and received, dozens of prizes in festivals, and a particular mention by the Pope. The Pope has seen it and liked it very, very much. And that particular movie is really important because what it does is it really sheds a very positive light on the relationship between Jews and Catholics. And it's a very inspiring, warm little vignette. And that's kind of what we're trying to do, is to just make, bridge gaps, bridge cultural divides,
So that's what that story does. And then the other two are in the making, and they are, as I was saying earlier, to bridge the gap in history, to tell more of the addressing the Inquisition and then modernity.
And the focus is of course on Oporto, but one can, I'm assuming here, that one can draw out lessons for what happened elsewhere in Portugal during this period. Would that be correct?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we told the story because we had, the historical documents and archives that we owned, so we could tell the story accurately. Because that's the thing. It was very important to tell the story accurately and to make sure that things were correct and precise. But that is an interesting picture of what would have been happening in Portugal throughout, absolutely.
And so coming up will be the story of Portugal during World War II, correct? Or
No, not really. More the Inquisition. It'll be the period during the Inquisition, and then tying it all together.
But the period during World War II itself was interesting, given the nature of the government in Portugal and the fact that Portugal was a kind of an entrepot, a transit point for any manner of refugees, including many Jews, escaping the Nazis. So where will that story be told?
I can't say. Honestly, I don't know that is a focus right now of a specific movie. It already is told in Sefarad, so I don't think it will be addressed again, because that is part of what is addressed in Sefarad, that the synagogue was used as a place of refuge for refugees coming from Nazi occupied countries. And I should tell you that the captain and the people that were there at the time were kept incredibly good, detailed records of the people that came. And we actually digitized all those records and sent it to the Holocaust Museum because in the States, because it's so interesting, because they would say, what their names were, where they were coming, where they were going, what they did, what their profession was, just small details on little cards. And that's very, very interesting. And most people, when they came, they were all planning to go on to the States or to Latin America. They weren't really planning to stay in Portugal, and very, very few did. But many did depart from Porto and Lisbon to take ships to America.
And where do you see the group that put this together, your husband, yourself, and others in the community, where do you see this going in terms of some kind of a permanent project or enterprise relating to Portuguese Jewish history and to the future of Portuguese Jewry?
Well, I mean, it's part of it's shown. We have a museum, and I think, as you may know, in fact, the president of B'nai B'rith, Mr. Charles Kaufman, actually inaugurated the museum in Porto, and this is also available in many other cultural institutions throughout the world. So the idea is to foster cultural and educational awareness of Jewish history and culture, and this is just one aspect, obviously, but it's an interesting story. And the aim of our community is to do an outreach and education. So that's something we will continue to do through this means or through others. We've also helped publish books. We have enormous number of educational outreach programs. Thousands of children and schools and teachers come to the community and are taught about Jewish history and culture. So it's a very large global project that the Porto community has. We work with international philanthropists, with B'nai B'rith itself as well, the ADL, the Israeli embassy and government. So it's a big project, and this is one element of it.
So when tourists come to Oporto, what Jewish tourists or those who are looking into Jewish history, what's the first thing they do if they haven't contacted you ahead of time? Where do they head first? What do they ask for? The synagogue?
Yes, it's on the map. It's the tourist board it's literally placed as a monument on maps of Oporto. However, I should caution you that the synagogue is closed to visitors. It's only for services now. So anybody that wants to attend a service that is Jewish can, during service when there are services. And there is a museum now that is open, and that is for everybody. Anybody can go to the museum.
I know that you mentioned our president, Chuck Kaufman, who did spend a few days after our leadership meeting in Lisbon and did go to Porto and has really, I know, become a big booster, as all of us are here at B'nai B'rith, of all the important work that you've done, not only with the movie, but also in terms of Jewish culture and telling the story, a story that, again, not many people in our own community know, and certainly beyond that are not familiar with, telling that story and getting into the mainstream of the narrative of Jewish history. And so we're deeply appreciative for that. And Dara, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope at some point you'll come back and tell us more about some of the movies that you'll be making.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and yes, I'd love to come back, and I'll give you more information once it's up and running.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening to our podcast today. Please visit our website, bnaibrith.org, like our Facebook page, follow us on Twitter, subscribe on your smartphone through the podcast app for iPhone or through Google Play for Android. And lastly, tell a friend about us. For my guest, Dara Jeffries, I'm Dan Mariashan. We'll talk to you next time on the B'nai B'rith International Podcast.